So Nicole, we discussed what kind of subject to to delve into here, and we decided on phosphorus, and then I thought, well, you can't really talk about phosphorus without talking about other things like nitrogen. So the subject is phosphorus, but it's also about the things that relate, the things like nitrogen when it relates to phosphorus. So why phosphorus? Why are we concerned about phosphorus? You hear about phosphorus quite a bit. Part of the problem is that there's certain parts of the world where phosphorus is accumulating. And one of those areas is the lower Fraser Valley where we are, and I assume that the same thing is more or less going on around here. And if you look at If you look at a map of Western Canada, there's hot spots of phosphorus, but the hottest of all the spots is the lower Fraser Valley. And if you extended this across Canada, it would still be the hottest spot in the country. So there's just a huge accumulation of phosphorus in the area, and it's attributable to high animal density. So it's 2.5 million cows per acre, so about a cow per acre. Lots of poultry, you don't have that here, but we do. And none of them have any land really that's attached to the farms. And on top of that, you have intensive horticultural production. So all those factors contribute to a huge importation of phosphorus. And if you look at a balance for the region, for just the agricultural part of the region, you see that you bring in about 5,000 tons, and ton is a ton, it's the same, every year as feed, and about almost a ton as fertilizer, and the output is much less than that. So you have a surplus of about 4,000 tons of actual phosphorus, and what that translates into, if you were to translate into the fertilizer product, it would be about 20,000 tons of surplus phosphorus fertilizer product that's imported as a surplus, more than what is needed every single year. So maybe 20,000 one-ton truckloads of fertilizer. That's the surplus that we bring into the Fraser Valley. So it's not trivial by any means. And where does it come from? It all comes from crops that are produced, in our case, in the prairies in Canada. Some of it come from corn from the US or other supplements. And since all the nutrients go this way and none of the nutrients go back, then you have to have mine fertilizer that come back and replenish the soils that produce the crops that are all shipped over here. So you have to have mines, and the mines are brought over. So people are worried that that phosphorus fertilizer is running out. And I got this a few years ago now. I think there's a little bit more optimism about the phosphorus supply now. It depends who you talk to, but the industry doesn't seem to be too worried in the 200 to 300 year time frame. But nonetheless, it's a finite supply. When we use it, it's gone, and there will be less. And there's one more factor that makes it just a little bit more dodgy, and that is that there's the question of quality of phosphorus. So in a lot of mines, phosphorus is associated with cadmium, and cadmium is toxic. So in fact, some of the phosphorus we're already applying now, particularly from Idaho, has high cadmium levels. And as we use up the good supplies, such as Florida, the cleaner phosphorus, we have a good mine in Western Ontario. As those clean supplies get used up, we'll be pushed to use more of the not so clean. And so we're bringing in yet another problem. Cadmium, is it an issue? Yeah, it can be an issue. There are crops that accumulate cadmium naturally, and they happen to be the healthiest crops, some of the most healthful crops. So for example, well, the worst is sunflower. You almost can't produce sunflower without an unsafe level of cadmium. But durum wheat, flax, potatoes, leafy vegetables, they all are cadmium accumulators. So they're things that we're considering. Beer is good, okay, no problem. So looking at the balance of phosphorus on a farm, typical dairy farm, we have inputs and outputs, and the inputs are in form of concentrates. In this case, kilograms per hectare, pounds per acre, almost identical, for all intents and purposes, just think of pounds per acre here. So we're bringing in about 50 as concentrates in terms of phosphorus, of P2O5 in this case. Roughages, chemical fertilizer, and a little bit of atmospheric deposition. You get a total input of 94 pounds per acre. But you only export about 34, so you have a surplus of 60, okay, on a per acre basis of P2O5. It would be about maybe 25 of actual P surplus. So we have a surplus, and yet we're bringing in chemical fertilizer because most farmers apply phosphorus as a starter fertilizer. So why is that? So it all comes back to the question of manure and using manure as a fertilizer source. And we all know that manure contains a lot of nutrients, and it's a great nutrient source, and it's at least theoretically free. It's not so free when you add in the cost of dealing with it, but it's free as material. But it's notoriously difficult to use efficiently as a fertilizer source, and there's all kinds of reasons. So people who don't really understand farming, they don't understand that it's not so easy to use manure as a fertilizer source. They just don't really understand what the issues are. But farmers know that there's an issue of reliable and predictable response, and part of that is because a lot of the nutrients in the organic form, they're not immediately available, and you don't know when they're going to become available for sure, and you don't even know if they're going to become available. So we have, it's less reliable, less predictable than fertilizer. There are associated environmental risks that you don't have with fertilizer, such as bacterial contamination. And we had, it's funny, it's a very celebrated case in Canada, but I don't think it's widely known in the US. There was an incident of E. coli in a small town called Walkerton. And you guys hear about that? You've heard about it. So it's in Ontario. The whole town got sick. Several people died, and many dozens got permanently disabled of the ones that recovered. So it was just a monstrous problem, and it happened for two reasons. One is that the people who were looking after the water treatment didn't do a good job, but the other reason was that there was a manure application that a farmer did, a beef producer, and that it was traced without question to that manure application. But there's an interesting wrinkle to the story, which is kind of the reason why I mention it. So it turns out this farmer was a hobby farmer, and his real job was as a veterinarian. And he had this passion for keeping records. And he kept perfect records of what he had done, when he applied, how much he applied, and he completely followed the regulations. So he was, thanks to the records that he had, he was completely absolved of any responsibility for his part of the story of all these people getting sick and dying. And if he didn't have those records, he probably would never have been able to get back to that town. But so he's taken it on himself to go around the country and give lectures to farmers about the importance of record keeping. It kind of saved his skin. Even though it wasn't only his problem, it was also, or the farm problem, it was also a water treatment problem. But anyway, so there's environmental issues. We know there's nutrient loss issues. For example, ammonia volatilization. It's more, it happens more with manure than with fertilizer. It's hard to know the nutrient content. It doesn't, you don't have a bag with the analysis. Logistics are difficult, we all know that. But the most difficult problem, I think, of all, is the fact that you have a nutrient imbalance in the manure compared to what the crop needs. And the issue is that there's too little N for the amount of, too little nitrogen for the amount of phosphorus. So that's always the case. Crops need about 10-to-1 ratio, and manure does not have that, as you'll see. And the reason, in part, it's not the only reason, but it's an important reason, is that you lose a lot of nitrogen as ammonia gas, and it's the gas that volatilizes, that evaporates in the barns and storages, and then also at land application, and even in pastures, although less. So all the way along, when you're handling this manure, you're losing some nitrogen. So you're starting off and it's not really maybe as much as it should be. maybe because of the extra phosphorus that's being supplemented to the end, to the stock. And then all the way along, you lose some of this nitrogen. So at the end of the day, you have a ratio of something like 5 or 6 to 1 of nitrogen to phosphorus, and you want 10 to 1. This is when you're applying it on the field, and then after you apply it, you're going to lose maybe 20-30% of the nitrogen as ammonia unless you inject it. So then all of a sudden you're down to maybe 4 to 1. And so that's not good enough for the crop. So if you keep applying manure year after year as your main source of nutrients, this is what's going to happen, and this happens everywhere. This is a worldwide situation. The phosphorus builds up, especially in the upper layers of the soil. So and the only alternative to this is to apply less, and then you won't have enough nitrogen, so you have to use fertilizer. So you've already got too much manure, and now you're adding fertilizer. And not only that, you're adding phosphorus fertilizer. We'll talk about that in a minute. So it turns out that not all manure is the same. Most is fairly close in terms of this nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, somewhere between, let's say, 4 and 6. Not a really good ratio to go on the land. But there's these guys here that have a kind of a nice ratio. And they all have a low dry matter content. And so what these are like the second stage in lagoon systems, or if you let manure settle for a while, then it's the supernatant on top. And so when you have low dry matter because of some kind of separation that's going on, then you have a higher nitrogen to phosphorus ratio. And why is that? It's because the solids contain most of the phosphorus. The liquid contains most of the available nitrogen, and the solids contain the phosphorus and the organic part of the nitrogen, most of that. So that's the part that's not so readily available and not so predictably available. So if you use this material, then you've got a very nice high nitrogen, low phosphorus, readily available nitrogen, almost like a fertilizer source. And when you look what happens when you allow manure to settle, this is like the supernatant, and in this case we have a ratio of 6 to 7 to 1. Compared to 5 to 1 when we start, and the sludge here, which is the stuff that settles to the bottom, you've got only about a 2 to 1 ratio here. So our idea was to use the supernatant, so we're not looking at a lot of hard work here. We're just, in fact, instead of agitating the manure, we're saying take the material on the top and use that, especially in spring and early summer, for applying on grass. And we did that for a number of years to see how it works. And then later on we'll talk a little bit about the sludge. So this is what our application looks like. We use broadcasting, and we also used the airway system, and we also used a sliding shoe, 3 different methods of application. But the story on the manure separation is this. So this is whole manure, and then you get a kind of response of the grass to higher rates of application because you need nitrogen, and so you're getting a response to the higher rates of manure application here. And this indicates the rate of application. But these bars tell you the amount of phosphorus you're adding at the same time. So you're getting this much grass, but the more grass you want, then the more phosphorus you load in. And this is here at a very high rate. You're talking about over 100 pounds per acre of phosphorus that you're adding in a crop doesn't remove anything like that, maybe 20 or 30. Would you agree, Chris? 20 or 30 pounds you're removing, maybe? So compare that with the separated liquid. You're getting more response for the same amount of nitrogen, that's why the curve is higher, and you're getting less loading of phosphorus because there's less phosphorus because the phosphorus is settled out. Okay, so why do you get this better response? There's 2 reasons, both important. One is that you've removed the less available nitrogen. So compared to what's left, the nitrogen that's left is more effective. So you're going to get more bang for your buck or bang for your pound of applied nitrogen. The other reason is that manure is thin and it soaks into the soil more rapidly, and especially if the soil isn't too wet, then you'll get less ammonia loss. So that you win 2 ways with this separated liquid material, and it's more efficient for increasing production, and you get less loading. But now there's the question of the sludge, And what do you do with the sludge? And so we had this idea, this sludge is loaded with phosphorus. We know that the crops need, the corn crops need phosphorus, and we've done studies to look at this. So this is the relationship on farms, this is on farm trials over 3 years. If you look at how much phosphorus is taken up by the crop at 6 leaves, you can always predict the amount of grain you're going to get in your crop. It's that important. And it's at 6 leaves. So, plant that big, right? And that big. So that early phosphorus nutrition is really, really important, and you kind of can't get it back exactly. And even the yield, no, this is the dry matter percent, sorry, and the dry matter percent is up too. So these are all different farms, and those that applied, they all tested high in soil, but those that applied additional starter phosphorus, they all had slightly better dry matter in their silage. It was significant, and this kept showing up. So the farmers are right in supplementing phosphorus as a starter fertilizer, even when the fields are already high. And this is an issue because there's phosphorus regulations coming down, right? So we thought, well, why don't we use the manure to replace that phosphorus in the same way? Because for that phosphorus to work, it has to be near the seed. The starter phosphorus has to be within 2 inches of the seed, or it's just not going to work. So can you do that with manure? So what we did was we put together an injection unit, and the injection tools, kind of hard to see, but it's just a single disc with just a shovel on the end. And they're spaced 2.5 feet apart, the same as the corn row spacing, and we inject into the soil a few days before planting. And then we go in and we plant as close as we can to where the injection was. Okay, this is a no-till situation, but it could be till, or we've done it with till and no-till. Okay, so how do you do this? I mean, the easiest way is just to follow your tire tracks, and it works. So the question is, can you be too close? And the answer is no. We looked at that. I'll show you some data in a minute. Can you be too far? Yeah, you can be too far. So if you're more than, if you're 4 inches apart, it's too far. You still get benefit, but not as much. So you want to try to be less than, like around, well, let's say less than 4 inches. And this is what it looks like when the corn's coming up. So these lines that I kind of drew in here match these little sticks that we put in to be exactly where the injection furrow was. Okay, and then these lines show you that, and then the corn is coming up, and then the same thing here, not necessarily the same plot, but and you can see that the corn is responding nicely, and there's no detrimental effect to the putting in of the sludge. So when we look at the results, tons per hectare, so here you've got to divide by half to get tons per acre. Okay, so this would be about 8, roughly. So when you look at these results, you can see that this is the control with nothing. This is what you would do with a straight fertilizer, and this is a sludge, and the sludge at 0 centimeters, or 0 distance, this is 2 inches. So 2 inches apart, so if you're within 2 inches, then you will match or exceed the performance of a fertilizer. Okay, so you don't need the fertilizer. But if you go 4 inches, then it starts to go down a little bit, but still way, way, way better than the control. But you can see that the performance starts to go down a little bit. So you have some leeway. This isn't a disaster or anything like that, but the goal should be to get as close as you can. And this is where we looked at possible negative effects, because we thought we saw some at one point, but when we tried it, even if you seed right after you put the manure in, if you could, it's a little hard because it's too wet. We did this by hand. We tried different distances, different timing, and basically there was no ill effect under our conditions. It might be different under very dry conditions, but we don't have that issue. Just want to put this in because the weird thing about phosphorus is that with certain crops, with many crops actually, most crops, they depend on an association with a fungus to take up that phosphorus. And this is really important when the plants are small and the roots are not so well developed. So phosphorus, unlike nitrogen, is fairly immobile in the soil. Nitrogen, no problem. It moves around in the water moves. It's easily available. But phosphorus, it's not soluble, or not very soluble, and it doesn't move in the soil very well. So the roots have to reach out and get it. But corn doesn't have a good root system, especially when it's very small. So it depends on these fungi, these basically filaments in the soil that are attached to the roots, and they are very fine, and they reach out to a much bigger distance than the roots themselves do, and they bring in the phosphorus into the roots. And we've tested this quite a bit, and in fact, even in our high phosphorus soils, even when you apply phosphorus, these organisms are still important. They're still important. And they're always there, but if you do heavy cultivation, the filaments will be broken down. It'll take them a while to set themselves back up. And so during that time, you can have a delay in phosphorus availability. They will come back. They're everywhere. Almost every crop benefits or is associated with these mycorrhizae, but there's some exceptions. All the cabbage family doesn't associate with these fungi, and all the weeds that belong to that family. So there's a whole lot of weeds like shepherd's spurs and stinkweed and so on, mustard. They don't associate. So if you grow a crop of corn after you grow a crop of cabbage, then the phosphorus uptake will be impeded. Also, if you cultivate very intensely, so if you rototill, you'll produce the same effect. Or if you have a year of fallow, so if you're growing corn and you didn't have any crop there at all the year before, then you'll have phosphorus deficiency. And you can alleviate that with adding phosphorus, but the fungi stay important no matter what. So we looked at whether the manure put in these bands interferes with that, and it doesn't look like it interferes at all. So that was nice to see. So now we looked at the overall response to the nitrogen component in that manure, and we see that this is nitrogen fertilizer without any phosphorus. This is nitrogen fertilizer with phosphorus added. Okay, and you get so here we're close to 19 tons, so what almost 10 tons per acre, 8 to 9 tons, let's say, per acre. Oops, going too fast. So this is fertilizer, and this is the injected manure. So the injected manure is as good, for the same amount of nitrogen, is as good as the fertilizer by itself. And then if you put injected with some starter, you do even better. Okay, so you can do even better. So, but to get the maximum yield without the starter fertilizer, then you have to go to a higher rate of manure. You're up to over 200, and I'll show you what that means later. And then if you add the fertilizer, the starter, then you can reach that peak at a lower total nitrogen rate. But you can get there with straight manure. But in any case, you can match your fertilizer. Now, this yellow spot here is a little hard to see. So this is your farmer standard. So this is broadcast manure, just generally broadcast manure, and starter fertilizer. So we can match easily with what the farmer does with just straight manure injection. And this is maybe a little bit confusing, but this is the amount of phosphorus we add. So so this is what the farmer is adding with the starter and with the manure, 60 kilograms of P, which is, again, in terms of P2O5, is twice that. In terms of product, it's 4 times that in round numbers. Kilograms per hectare, again, same as pound per acre for all intents and purposes. It's 10% less, actually, so if it's 60, it would be 50 or 55. But anyway, so the idea here is that as you are adding more nitrogen, you're also adding more phosphorus. And if you do what the conventional practice, you're adding about 60. If you do this injection of manure with starter, you're up to 60 or even more. And you can get very nice yields with much lower levels of phosphorus addition if you go without the addition starters. You have nice yield and you don't have quite the phosphorus loading. So, but there are always many things in the environment, and so we're looking at the effect of phosphorus, and then you have to take the influence that it has on this nitrogen story. So one of the problems with with nitrogen is that it has all kinds of environmental impacts due to the gases that it produces. So one of the gases I mentioned is ammonia, and if you spread manure on the surface, you know you lose a lot of ammonia, that's nitrogen gone. So a positive in this story is when you inject that manure, you don't lose ammonia. So we know that when it's injected and completely covered in soil, there's no ammonia loss. So there's actually a secondary benefit to having more nitrogen conserved by injecting the manure in the system. However, it so happens there's also a negative, because we measured nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is I'm sure that you've heard about it by now. It's a greenhouse gas. And from agriculture, it's the second most important. From soils, it's the most important greenhouse gas. 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, but not present in the size concentrations. But it's a very important gas. It's usually produced when there's no air. Okay, when nitrogen, when you have nitrate in the soil and there's no air, then you can get, and it's moist, then you get nitrous oxide. So you put this manure band, it's quite wet in the spring, there's a high concentration of nitrate after a little while, and then you get these spikes of nitrous oxide, which we measured. And so we found that by injecting the manure, you actually double the amount of nitrous oxide. It's not a huge worry because still the rates are not that high, but it's a negative that we need to address. So, and we have some ideas on what to do about that, and that's where some of our research is going now. But I brought it up not to downgrade the idea, but just to point out how important it is to consider all the various aspects of a system. And when you change one thing, you change something else, and maybe for the better, or it may not be for the better, or it may have no effect at all on something else. So the conclusion as far as the sludge goes is that it can replace starter P, and that it doesn't cause any harm to the corn crop, and it can reduce your ammonia loss, so that it's mostly a win-win-win with this one warning about the nitrous oxide. So that's the story about phosphorus and nitrogen from a manure management standpoint. And so if you've got your manure, these are some ideas, some ideas about what to do about it and what the issues are and so on. But to understand the nutrients on a farm, it's not enough to deal with the end products or the problem of dealing with the manure. The amount of manure, the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus you have on the farm depends on the inputs that you bring onto the farm. Because what you bring in is what you're going to have to deal with. So this here is a flow diagram of a model farm in the Netherlands. And a model farm because they tried to manage this farm to be as tight and as in terms of managing nitrogen and phosphorus so that there are no losses into the environment. Okay, so they tried all the technology that was available, everything they could think of in order to minimize losses. And the losses that you see here, which you don't need to look at per se, but they're really quite low in terms of what are lost back to the environment. So they brought in all these changes into their practices like better manure application and so on. But the single biggest change that they made was not an obvious one that improved the situation. And that was when they switched from growing almost exclusively grass to about half grass and half corn. And the history in the Netherlands is that they didn't have the early varieties before that they could grow corn. And now with the improvements in genetics, they could. So why that's interesting is that if you talk to anyone who knows anything about soils, they'll tell you that corn is worse for the environment than grass. Grass is more stable, corn is more unstable. So it has poor root system, it's not there half the year, it's got all kinds of issues that grass doesn't have. And yet, when you converted half the farm from grass to corn, they greatly reduce the losses of nitrogen into the environment. So why is that? So the reason is that by growing corn, they could better produce the feed that they needed for their cows. So the feed that they produced better matched what the cows needed, so they needed to bring in less feed. So they could bring in, they had more energy, they needed to bring in less concentrate. And they didn't overproduce protein. which is hard to do if you're only feeding grass. So there, you didn't overfeed protein because now the corn is low in protein. So the point is that by looking at the system as a whole, you could do something that you couldn't do with just managing a part of the system, like the manure. Okay, so how does that relate to us? So typically, in our grass harvesting management in our side of the border, I think it's similar to what it is here. This is what farmers would do. They would have a 5-cut harvest system for their grass, and they would use an early maturing variety. So an early maturing variety and cut several times, 5 times in a year, approximately. But when you do that, and that comes from a tradition of trying to get the most energy and the most digestible nutrients from the grass. But it doesn't give you the most yield. In fact, you give up a lot of yield. And so we did this experiment over 3 years, and we compared a 3-cut system with a 5-cut system. And this is the total dry matter yield. Tons per hectare, so again, for tons per acre, it's half as much. And this is dry matter. Okay, so if you are using 5-cut system, then you better use an early variety. If you use a late variety, you're going to take a hit. Okay, but if you use a 3-cut system, your yields will be higher. So we're giving up yield. But if you use a late variety with a 3-cut system, you won't be giving up yield. And why late variety? Because if you do 3 cuts, you're going to be cutting less often, so it'll be later. The first cut will be later. And the late variety, being maturing later, won't be as mature, and the quality won't go down as much. Okay, so that's the idea that we tested. So with the idea that why shouldn't we produce more feed? So if we produce more feed on a farm, then we will need to bring in less feed if it all works out at the end when you're feeding cows. Okay, so that's the idea. So we're giving up some yield. Also, if we can produce more feed from the grass, then maybe we don't need as many acres of grass, and we know the corn yields more than grass, especially if you grow a relay crop and feed it. So there's another possible side effect of corn. We would guess yields 30% more than the grass, typically. But when we looked at the quality, it wasn't as good. So it was a little bit disappointing. So this is the 5-cut system, has lower NDF as one of the indicators. And there are many indicators, I just chose this one. But if you look here, yeah, you're going down from about 59 to 57. It's not, or 50, maybe 60 to 57, something like that. You lose about 3 points. But it's a little bit better using the late variety, but still not as good. So this is what the quality looks like, and 5-cut system with the early variety and a 3-cut system with the late variety. That's what we're saying. Maybe this will work nicely. And we see, yeah, in fact, NDF has gone up. It's a negative. Lignin has gone up. That's the fibers. It's a good. This is in vitro digestibility at 30. So it's the speed of digestibility. It's gone down. It's not good. And this is the rate of digestion of carbohydrates. Gone down. It's not good. And what's worse is in 2010 when we did this, actually it was worse. So I bring that up because that's interesting. So what happened here is that crop had a lot of stems. It was a very stemmy crop. And that's something I think that people don't pay attention to. Grass is grass, but if you let it grow a little longer, if you cut it very early, it doesn't make too much difference. And that's why we didn't separate those numbers. But if you're delayed in cutting, how fast that quality will decline will depend on the stems there are. And the same variety, but just in different years, may have more or less stems. So if you see that it's a stemmy crop, it's producing a lot of seed heads, then it's really important to harvest that as early as possible. Okay, so that's something that is overlooked, I think. But getting back to the story of feeding this out. So now if you try feeding this out, so we did this 2 scenarios. And this is modeled. Okay, we didn't actually feed it, but this is using the AMTS cattle pro model, and this is what how we would balance the ration. So the first scenario, we kept the same amount of orchard grass silage and corn silage, but this is the higher quality grass, and this is lower quality grass. And then we changed some of the other parameters, and it worked, but there was a little bit of a hit in milk yield. So the milk yield was a bit lower. So we got a little more grass, but we got a little less milk. So that's not really a good thing. And it was a little bit worse. So we lost about 0.8 kilograms, and here we lost about 1.1. Now we tried a different way, and what we said was, okay, we're going to feed more corn and a little less grass, and we're going to make that up with some corn, because we potentially can now grow more corn. So when we did that, then we actually did not lose any yield, any milk yield at all. We maintained, the corn is small, we maintained milk production. And so now the benefits are that we need less grass, so we can save some land on grass. We need a little more corn, so we can grow some of that corn on the grassland, but that already has more yield. You have a relay crop, you'll do even better. And you'll still have some land left over, because the corn is high yielding, and you can grow some additional, maybe high protein crops, because this tends to be a little bit lower in protein, so you can maybe grow some clover and bring in less supplement to the field. So this is something that's this kind of trying to rationalize the overall crop production with what is best in terms of minimizing inputs and overall costs. No one has really done that, not in our neck of the woods anyway, because the only people who are formulating feeds are the guys who are selling the feed. And kind of it's not in their prime interest to reduce the amount of feed that they're selling. So maybe they will tell you if they know, but they won't be looking for this kind of answer. So there may be some opportunities, like they did in Netherlands, of trying to modify the crops that are grown in order to actually bring in import less feed, save money, and bring in less nutrients, less phosphorus, and making the farm as a whole more sustainable. So that's the story. Be glad for questions, or not.
Did you look at any of the variety trial? You had early, late orchard grass. Did you look at other variety versions best you?
No, we didn't, and we only looked at one variety of each, so that's something we should do. And we should also look at different fertilizer rates to match this. First, we wanted to see if this idea held out. We did. Ryegrass is not so used in our area. I don't know. People think. I think it's used a little bit more down here. So I don't think there'll be a big call for ryegrass. That's what you asked about rye, right? Tall fescue doesn't have the range of maturity that the orchard grass does. Also, it's more difficult to assess the maturity because it doesn't naturally have as many seed heads. It's less kind of determined. It doesn't all head out exactly at the same time. So it's a little bit less clear cut. And also, we're still probably 2/3 orchard grass. But it's a good question. I think we should look at other orchard grass varieties because just looking at one late variety, there may be some better ones out there. And it's about 2 weeks difference in maturity between the early and the late.
Yeah, since I came late, where is your research being done?
At Agassiz?
Oh, okay.
You know where that is?
Yeah, very much so. So did you make any cost comparisons when it comes to grow corn as opposed to grass and harvest the two? Was that worked in here?
No, we didn't do a full costing, but I would say that that they're comparable in a sense because farmers are doing both, and it's a matter of shifting a little bit more in one direction or another. Corn is maybe a little bit more flexible because if some of your land is away from your farm, then you're more likely to grow corn on it. But of course, every farm is different, and for some farms, they're not as keen on growing corn. There's been an increase in corn production in Canada, on our side of the border. I don't know if it's like that here. I would say it was, when I first came about 20 years ago, it was maybe 30%, 30-70 corn to grass. And then it went up and then went back down after a couple of bad corn years, and now it's easily 50-50 corn and grass.
Did you look at the nutrient uptake difference between having just the grass and the corn-grass combo for the nitrogen and phosphorus part of things for your soil chemistry?
Well, for this model example, we didn't do that, but we've done this at other times, and we do have a pretty good idea. So the difference between corn and grass that's well known to biologists, but not so well known in kind of the public, is that they belong to two different groups of plants. There's the temperate or cool season plants and warm season plants. And they have very different physiology. And most of the crops that we grow are cool season crops. I mean, the berries are cool season, and cereals are cool season, and the grasses that we use are cool season. But there are other grasses that aren't. They're warm season, and one of the warm season grasses is corn. Corn's a grass. It's a warm season grass. So what it is, it has a different photosynthesis system. And basically, it's designed to be more efficient in terms of water use, and it's also more efficient in terms of nitrogen use, or nutrient use in general, but also nitrogen use. So for the amount of dry matter that you put on, I mean, there are many factors, but overall, the amount of dry matter that you accumulate for the amount of water that you use is always more with the warm season. They're adapted to do that. So if the stomata is open, so the little pores in the leaves are open a certain amount, they will take in more carbon dioxide and give less water for that amount than the cool season. And the reason is that they suck up that carbon dioxide goes into, and they remove it very quickly, so that there isn't a buildup underneath. And so as soon as it's removed, then more comes in. And so for the same amount of water loss, those plants can suck in more carbon dioxide. And so those plants are inherently more efficient in water and also in nutrient use. So what that means is, if you take out less nitrogen, and there's a direct relationship between nitrogen and protein. In fact, the way we analyze for protein is we just analyze for nitrogen multiplied by 6.25. And that's done routinely all over the world with plants. And that's why it's called crude protein, and it's a very good indicator. So it's a very tight relationship between nitrogen and protein. So if you're being efficient by needing less nitrogen, it also means you have less protein in the crop, which is why corn has less protein than grass typically. Okay, so what that means is for a certain amount of crop, you will get less removal of nutrients with corn than you will with grass. Okay, and that has its good and bad effects. If you're trying to draw down phosphorus, it's not a good idea to do it with corn. You're better off to do it with alfalfa, which is a cool season crop, with a very high nutrient demand and very high water demand too. So, but if you want to grow a crop with less nutrients, then corn is a very good crop to grow. But if you don't put nitrogen on, or it doesn't take it as much, then you don't have as much in the feed. So are you overfeeding protein? You know, these are all the many questions. So I don't know if that answered your question or not. But you won't remove as many nutrients with corn for a ton of dry matter as you would with the grass. And of course, it depends how much yield you get. So, you know, if you have typically 2.5 to 3% nitrogen in grass, you'll only have maybe 1% or slightly over 1% with corn.
How about for phosphorus?
Yeah, it's more or less the same relationship. Yeah. So you could probably remove 40 kilograms maybe of phosphorus, but you'd be hard pressed to move more than 25 with corn, even though the corn may have a higher yield. So I think the nitrogen is more pronounced, but it's also the same effect with phosphorus.
So do you do any work yourself with dairy nutrition?
No, I don't, and that's a big deficiency. We don't really have nutritionists to work with, and the person who did the nutrient modeling there is someone who used to work in our area and has now moved to Alberta, and I had to sweet talk her to do that modeling for us. But she was very interested. She used to work, she knows our system here very well, and she worked for several companies, but she never really worked independently for like an institution. She always worked for a company, but she was also very motivated by the farmers, so she always was trying to really come up with cheap rations. But we need access to nutritionists.
So you grow any alfalfa in Agassiz?
Do we grow any alfalfa? We've grown alfalfa experimentally, and some farmers have grown it. No one has really stayed with it for a long time. I think no one really quite knows what to do with it, how it fits into the system, and in the end they go back to grass and corn. But if we were to try to manage the system more precisely in terms of nutrients, then alfalfa is interesting, and another crop that might be more interesting is red clover, because the protein quality of red clover in silage is higher than alfalfa in silage. Not so much in hay, but in silage. It doesn't have the enzymes that break the protein as much as alfalfa does, and so the protein molecules stay intact more in red clover, and red clover grows very well also in our area, like in this area. So if we had a little bit more land, then maybe that's something that we can do by saving some land, is growing a little more, I would say red clover, but maybe alfalfa. And if your soil is very wet, then red clover is very tolerant of wet soils, more so than alfalfa. So it's under, these things haven't been done as much as they might be. You know.
Chef, how your injection equipment, how deep do you inject?
So it depends. I would say it depends on the volume of manure to get. So we were, that's a really good question because I didn't really mention that. So we were aiming at 30 kilograms of phosphorus, of actual phosphorus in the manure, because we figured from our experience, if you apply 30, you're going to be definitely, you'll have your maximum bang for that phosphorus. If you cut back from 30, you know, some guys are only putting in 20. I know at 15 it doesn't work as well. We haven't tried all the different rates. So to be sure we had the most, we went with a 30 rate, and that's more or less sustainable with corn.
That's
you know,
P205.
That's P. That's actual P. Because, and that's another, I'll get back, but that's another important point, because we use P and we use P205 and we use product. I mean, there's three different ways to designate phosphorus. So the fertilizer companies, it's P205, but because that's how they do it, and on a bag it's P205, but if you're analyzing manure, why would you ever have P205, right? It's no connection with anything. So oftentimes it's reported as P. So there's about a P is about 40% of P205 roughly, if I remember correctly, something like that. Anyway, so we aim for 30 pounds per acre, or slightly less, maybe 28 in our case, pounds per acre of P, of actual P. So to get that from the manure and the sludge, and we do whole manure and we do sludge, then you have a certain volume. And it was about 6,000 gallons per acre that we apply. So you have to be able to get 6,000 gallons per acre in injections 2.5 feet apart, and that's quite a bit of volume. So you needed to go, depending on how thick or thin the manure was, you need to go at least 5 inches deep, maybe 6. And our particular contraption didn't have a good way to cover the soil. We covered it by hand, but it needs to be some kind of a closer on the back end that we just didn't develop for our experimental unit. But it's easy. I mean, you can just kick the soil back. It's not a really big problem. But that's an issue, because normally injection units are a foot apart or thereabouts, and here we're 2.5 feet apart. So you need more volume in your channel. But it's not insurmountable by a long way. It's quite doable. And there may be different type of openers that we haven't experimented with. You know, like with the crowfoot in the bottom or something that spreads it out more. You know, so we don't have a good engineering shop either, so we kind of do our own. So sometimes we don't look at all the tools that one might look at. To it.
What's your goal? What's the optimum time to get corn in the ground?
You know, as early as you can. We've never planted too early. And like we haven't tried an experiment where we plant, let's say, the 5th. As soon as you can get on it, like towards the end of April, plant it. Even if it looks like it's not doing anything, and it looks like it looks terrible and looks wet and peaked and yellow and everything, if it isn't actually going to die in a low spots, like you can get low spots and it's just going to die there, and probably, but everything that you plant early does better than anything you plant later. It just never catches up, and I can't really explain it, because it's not doing anything. So why is it so advantageous? But it is, always does better. Earlier planting always does better. So, you know, where they're interested in sorghum is in Quebec and eastern part of Canada. So there's some lines now of sweet sorghum that have high carbohydrate content, high sugar content, and they're getting very good results in their milk production from high sugar content. Another thing they're doing, which is kind of strange, is they're recommending harvesting in the afternoon, because they found that it's definitely increases the sugar content in Timothy. It would probably be the same with orchard grass. And all else being equal, even given that the crop is not going to dry that much at night, they still have, and they followed it through to feeding. It's going to be in our new grass book. There's 2 articles on that, and it seems to really be holding up to tests. So harvesting in the afternoon versus the morning.
Does direct cut? Is there direct cutting it?
No, they're making silage.
So you're saying, we always mow after noon. But then it takes another day or so to dry, but because you've cut it after 12, there's an advantage.
Yeah, well, cutting it in the afternoon after 4 maybe.
Or even after 4.
Yeah. To take advantage of all the photosynthesis that's taking place. So what happens is, the plants produce sugar, and then the sugar is used to make more plant, right? But there's a point when there's a lot of sugar being produced, and there's not so much plant being, so like it cycles during the day. So at night you have no sugar being produced because there's no sunlight, and the plant consumes some of that sugar. So the idea is that at the afternoon you have the maximum accumulation of sugar in the leaves and stems, and then when you cut it, then you get the minimum amount of loss through the night. You still get some loss, but not as much loss. So when all is said and done, you have a crop which has a higher sugar content. And
well, I'll have to change my strategy.
yeah, it's worth a try. I mean, they've really put it through a lot of tests under their conditions. It's with Timothy, so that we're not sure it would work the same way with orchard grass, but and like I say, they've taken it through feeding trials. So that wasn't what my subject was, but it is all part of the picture, because if you can make the farm more efficient, then you will have less environmental problems overall, as a generalization.
Does sorghum take up nutrients pretty well out of the soil?
Is what, sorry?
Does the sorghum take the nutrients out of the soil pretty well?
The sorghum, it's like corn. It's another one of these C4 plants, or warm season plants.
What kind of tonnage you get out of it?
Well, we've never done it. I mean, potentially it's good, but we're thinking of putting in a trial for the first time, maybe with this sweet sorghum.
So when should that be planted? Early also?
Yeah, but you can get, it doesn't do as well in cool weather as corn. So that may be a good crop to grow after a cut of grass. Or even after 2 cuts of grass maybe. Well, I don't know about that.
How about barley?
Yeah,
Are you guys working with it at all?
No, we haven't worked with it, but sometimes I don't know why people, if you're planting that late, I don't know why you wouldn't grow barley.
Yeah.
On the phosphorus.
On the phosphorus, contamination of surface water. So they've got problems with lakes, and they've got problem with the Baltic Sea. There's a huge amount of phosphorus in the Baltic Sea, and it's creating issues, nitrogen and phosphorus. Whether we have an issue here, I don't know, but certainly inland you have an issue when you have lakes. And phosphorus, I didn't mention it, but it causes eutrophication. I probably should have made that point.
It causes what?
So if you have freshwater systems like lakes and streams, they're clear because you don't have a lot of algae growing in them. And the reason that you don't have a lot of algae is because there's not a lot of nutrients. And the nutrient that's in limited supply, the one that's preventing them from growing, is phosphorus. So as soon as you add phosphorus to a lake, automatically the algae will grow like crazy. The lake will begin to stink. The algae will sink to the bottom. It'll rot, take the oxygen out of it, all the fish will die, the water temperature will go up, and basically that's called eutrophication, which basically troph is food, and it's too much food in the system. So, and it's directly attributable to phosphorus, and it happens all over the world. And the original research for that was done in Canada about 30 years ago by a guy named Schindler out of the University of Alberta, and they divided a lake in half. And they added phosphorus, small amount in one side, and the other side they didn't, and it was clear as anything. So that's a huge, huge issue, and that's what they're worried about in Gulf of Mexico, and so it's nitrogen and phosphorus. But in lakes, it's usually the phosphorus that's the limiting factor, not the nitrogen.